Welcome everyone to the October seminar of FemQuant. Chairing today, my name is Young-Cho Lee. I'm based at the Department of Social Policy and London School of Economics. And this seminar is being recorded, and at the same time we are live tweeting, so you can also follow us on Twitter if you don't already. For those of you who are new, Erin will first give her presentation, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for some Q&A for constructive feedback and questions that engage with the premises of the speaker's research. And I'd like to emphasize, because we have a smaller audience than we typically do, we would really appreciate it if everyone could engage actively in the Q&A session. And of course, it goes without saying that we expect everyone to be respectful and engage in the discussion in a considerate manner. So today's speaker is Dr. Erin Hengel. She's a research fellow at the UCL Social Research Institute, but I believe now she's based at the LSE Social Policy Department. She's an economist with research interest in applied microeconomic theory and gender economics. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge, and before coming to UCL was the lecturer in economics in the University of Liverpool. Her research has been published in journals such as History of Political Economy, Economic Journal, and Quantitative Science Studies. Today's presentation will be titled Gender and the Time Cost of Peer Review. And Erin, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm here to present a new-ish paper of mine called Gender and the Time Cost of Peer Review with two of my co-authors, Diane Alexander at Wharton and Olga Gorelkina at University of Liverpool. So this paper actually kind of came out of a situation in which we wanted to look at what are the reasons behind the so-called productivity paradox in academia. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with it, there is a paradox in academia such that women basically produce fewer papers than men, at least on a count basis. And this has been documented in several different studies. So it's a well-documented fact, so to say. But there's also a lot of data and analyses suggest that this gap is not a foregone conclusion. So this gap is amenable to being reduced, and I would hope eliminated. And some of the evidence to suggest that actually might be the case is, if you look at actual fields where you have really expensive to produce science. So this is, I think, the kind of the quintessential field would be physics and a collider. You see that actually this productivity gap is much higher. So when it's really expensive to do science, then men produce a lot more than women. But in fields where, in fact, it's a lot less expensive to do science or to do research, basically because you just need yourself and the ability to get to a library and do, I don't know, some sort of, to find a book that you need, for example, in literature, then you actually find that the difference is much smaller. It's also not constant across prestige of outlets. So you'll find it is largest at the most prestigious publication outlets, and it gets progressively smaller as the kind of the prestige of the outlets decline. So, and by prestige, I just mean like the typical kind of average prestige. In specific circumstances, you may not agree with that kind of ranking. But for example, like in book chapters, you find that the gap is much smaller. And it's also, I think this is a really important point. It's important to know that it depends on how you actually measure productivity as well. So if you look at productivity from a different perspective and say, well, how is there a gap in terms of, say, teaching in service to the profession or to the department? And it looks like actually maybe not. So there is a declining and possibly even a reversal in the gap on those dimensions. So we have this evidence that there is a gap. We also have this evidence to suggest that maybe this gap isn't something that is preordained. So what we wanted to look at in this paper was something that we had discovered in another paper of mine, which is looking at top economics journals and finds that women spend longer in peer review. We want to see whether that time spent in peer review actually might also contribute to the gap. So we're basically seeking to better understand if and why time women spending longer in peer review could actually affect their research productivity, and see if there is anything at all if we do discover that this is an issue, is there anything at all we can do about it? So the particular questions we'll be asking are, do referees review papers by female authors as quickly as they review papers by male authors? Do women spend more time responding to referees? And if we observe that there are gaps in both of these two axes, do those gaps happen to depend on how well-informed referees are about a journal's standards of acceptance? And that's really what we're trying to get at is it possible that referees are spending longer reviewing papers and women are spending longer responding to referees only when those referees actually don't have very good information about the journal, the standards of acceptance of journal, and perhaps aren't as experienced in distinguishing the types of articles that would actually be published in these journals. And as that experience and that accuracy improves, do we then observe that this gap declines? So we would then exploit this kind of exogenous variation in referee assignment, which I'll talk about in more detail later on, to see whether these gender gaps change as the same referee becomes more experienced in the referee process. And if we observe a change, we will then interpret that as a form of the information really is actually important, and providing experience is important for closing these gaps. So the data that we have is actually it's a unique data set that we obtained for energy economics, which is a field journal in the area of energy economics. So the way that we basically collected the data, so this is all of the data for energy economics on its submission between the years of effectively 2005 to 2019. So we first collected all the publicly available information on all full-length regular issue articles that were published or forthcoming and submitted to Energy Economics' online system with Elsevier, which only started existing in 2005. Before that, it was all by mail, until April 2019. And we only look at accepted papers, and I'll explain why in just a moment. We then, actually at that point, we thought that was the first step and that's all we would have to do. But then again, because one of our key things is to look at how experience of the referee actually improves or doesn't these gaps, it was really key that we get a proxy for experience that was as accurate as possible. So we noticed, however, that some of the referees had different logins. So you could have the same person who was actually logging in and refereeing one paper and then logging in with a different, sometimes because they changed institutions. So the proxy we wanted to use was actually the number of papers that they had actually reviewed for energy economics. So if you have that kind of, somebody having multiple logins, then that would break that chain of experience. So we had to fix that. So we then we extracted the names of all the referees, as well as kind of basic information about them, institution, email, et cetera. And then we went through that list and we just consolidated duplicates, which was actually relatively easy. So once we did that, then we had two data sets. We had basically all the data on the collected, on the published articles. Then we had a consolidated list of referees. We then wrote a Python program that basically went into Elsevier's editorial system and matched. It basically downloaded all of the review time metrics data and matched them with our own records. So that created for us a unique data set that basically had all the information on all of the papers that were ever submitted to Energy Economics and all of the review time data for every paper submitted to Energy Economics during our time period. And also kind of information about their referees in terms of experience, et cetera, as well as all of the information about the actual articles. So kind of the big thing I think here is, and the big question I often get is, why are we only looking at accepted papers? And there are really two reasons. So it's kind of both conceptual and practical. So it really is a conceptual reason. I mean, even in the absence of the practical reasons, I probably would split these out. And had two separate papers dealing with these issues. And that's because we really, if you think about the decision to reject versus the decision to offer, revise, and resubmit, they are actually very different decisions that one is making. So when you're reviewing a paper, if you think about, I'm just going to reject it, you may not be, you probably aren't as concerned about conveying good information to the authors. Whereas if you offer a revise and resubmit, you probably want to make sure that you're as clear as possible, or you want to provide a good report giving the author a good indication of how they can actually address the issues you have with their paper in a revise and resubmit. So you can also see how that's going to end up creating non-linearities in the relationship between time spent in peer review and the actual decision. So obviously, like a reject, which one could quantify as like the lowest decision, is going to, might, under this hypothesis, one would actually spend less time rejecting than they would be reviewing a paper that they give a major revision to. And that's actually what we do see in the data. So yeah, so basically these are two separate decisions. So we really want to actually concentrate on the one where there's real information that is being transmitted between the referee and the author. So we're avoiding potential of babbling equilibria, which would exist perhaps in the rejection, amongst the rejection. So they're not, in that case, the referee isn't really trying to convey information to the author. He's just writing a report because he has to, and he knows he's rejecting. So those are all conceptual issues that we just wanted to separate out. Additionally, there are actually real practical reasons for looking at accepted papers only. So the big thing is like a lot of these so what we need, and what we'll talk about in a moment, is we need basically, we want to be able to compare effectively like for like. So papers that normatively there is general agreement, not necessarily everybody, but on average, most people probably agree that they should these two papers should experience the same amount of time in peer review. So we have to have some sort of a proxy here for that normative judgment. And here we're going to use quality, you know, on the hypothesis, effectively, that referees are supposed to evaluate papers on their quality, and then based on their conditional on quality, we should believe that two papers probably should go through the two, parallel types of review processes. But for rejected papers, we don't have very good proxies for quality for many of them, because often some of them, they're submitted and they just go into the ether, right? So they're never published, at least in a version that's able to be found. So we can't get any kind of like citations. We don't get, we don't get any kind of variation in referee decisions, et cetera. Additionally, a lot of those rejected papers, not like for accepted papers, it's actually relatively easy to find authors' genders, because in this particular case on Elsevier, you can actually click on it, you can see it. Sometimes there's even a photo when you click on the author's name. And in any case, at that point, these authors usually have a website. So it's much easier to find these authors conditional on acceptance. There are a lot of authors that you find that, unconditional of acceptance, that are much harder to find, and it may be very difficult to actually find their genders. So that's not to say that we don't want to look at these issues. We're just leaving that on hold for right now. And that's why we're really focusing now on accepted papers only. Okay, so before I get to the actual results, I just want to go over some of the summary statistics. So here what we have are the number of manuscripts per year that we have in our data. So we have in total about 2,500 manuscripts. And on the left-hand side, we have the number that are published basically per year. And we see, in fact, that this has been rising over time, which kind of reflects the trends in the economics profession, at least, of having increasing numbers of people in economics over time. Interestingly, however, we actually don't see, so we're proxying for gender here, using the gender of the corresponding author using a binary variable just equal to 1 or 0 if the corresponding author is female. Although we do use I can also talk about the results using other proxies. But what's interesting here is when you use this female author manuscript using female corresponding author as the gender, it's actually relatively flat. So it hasn't, there have been increasing numbers of articles published in energy economics over our sample period, but there has not been an increase in the percentage of female author manuscripts published during this period. Okay, so here is one of our main outcome variables. This is just a basic summary statistic. This is time spent with referees. So in the actual analysis, we're going to use round specific. We're going to be analyzing everything at the unit of analysis will be the round. Okay, so we have a total of 7,500 observations of referees reviewing a paper. Again, that's round specific. About 1,100 of which have a female corresponding author. Now, the vast majority of these did not recommend rejection. Okay, so this is conditional on acceptance. The vast majority of papers, all of the referees basically agreed that they would accept. So we're actually dropping all the 300 or so observations or 400 or so observations of people of rounds where a referee rejected a paper, but it was still accepted in the end. And that's because, again, for the reasons I discussed earlier, we really conceptually, we want to concentrate on situations in which the referee is trying to convey good information to the author. Now, there's also a reason for that. Some people familiar with peer review may think that's relatively high. I don't actually know exactly how high it is in relation to other journals. I think actually, especially at least in econ, it's actually not the, it is relatively. I think others have shown it's relatively common for papers only to be accepted if all of the referees accept it. That's actually also an explicit policy at Energy Economics. So Energy Economics has a policy basically of only publishing papers where generally only publishing papers where all referees actually agreed to accept the paper. And that's why the overlap between the number of rounds conditional on acceptance and the number of rounds conditional on actually the referee recommending acceptance are so similar. Okay, so again, what we have over here on the left-hand side is something that actually surprised me when I first looked at it. And this is the average amount of time, total amount of time that papers are spending with referees. And we see it's actually relatively flat over the time period. So there's been kind of this, I think there's this kind of hypothesis in economics, at least, that review times have been increasing over the past 20 years. And I think they were increasing before that, but actually they've leveled off, at least in this journal. And they're not actually increasing. On the right-hand side, we break down the total amount of time that papers spend with referees by whether the author of that paper corresponding author was female or male. And we see actually that papers with a female corresponding author are spending longer with referees than papers with a male corresponding author. So the average number of total days that a manuscript spends with referees has not radically changed over our sample period. We do observe, however, that referees take slightly longer to review female author papers on average in our summary statistics. We observe the exact same thing when we look at time with authors, which is our secondary outcome variable of interest. So here now we have about 4,000 observations of authors. So again, round specific observations of authors revising their papers, about 600 of which have a corresponding author. And again, the left-hand graph is showing the average total number of days that an author spends revising their manuscript after receiving a revised and resubmit. And it actually hasn't been increasing. It's been relatively flat. On the right-hand side, we then see the total number of days that authors spend revising, broken down by whether the author was a male corresponding author or a female corresponding author. And we actually see here again that women are spending longer revising their papers compared to men. So average number of total days authors spend revising their manuscript has also not radically changed, just like with time with referees. But again, women are taking longer to revise than men are. Now, this is kind of the final graph of summary statistics, and it is data on rounds of review. So we don't use this as an outcome variable in this paper, although I can talk about it if you want me to. But we're seeing the exact same trend. So this is the average number of rounds a paper goes through before it's actually eventually accepted. And again, it's been relatively flat over the sample period. On the right-hand side, we have the distribution of rounds by author gender, and we see that women are underrepresented in manuscripts that are accepted in the first or second round, and men are they are overrepresented in manuscripts that are accepted in the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth round. So basically what that means is that papers with a female corresponding author do go through more rounds of review on average at this journal. Okay, so those are the summary statistics. Now I will go on to the main analysis. So as I already mentioned, all analyses are round specific. Just to kind of give you an outline of how this is, we're going to be quantifying this. We're defining a round as starting with the paper with the author. This could be at the very round zero would be, when the author is drafting the paper, and then that's stage zero, and then they submit it to the journal. The journal sends it out to referees. Then referees have a decision. They make the decision whether to reject or not to reject. Now, again, we're only looking at the decisions that are not reject. Conditional on not rejecting. They then say that to the editor. The editor then consolidates, looks at all of the results, decides what he wants to decide as the decision, which generally is just accept if all the referees accept. And then he sends the paper back to the author in stage 0. So then that begins the next round. So, and just emphasize again, we are only looking at not rejected manuscripts in which referees did not recommend reject. And it is round specific. So every analysis that we see is going to be round specific. And in fact, if you want me to, we do have in the paper non-round specific analyses, which are much bigger. But I'll talk about those if somebody has a question about it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we really want to do is we want to simulate a situation in which people can generally agree. There's like a normative agreement that 2 papers probably should experience the same peer review process. And so what we want to do to achieve that is to condition on the things that referees are supposed to be deciding on in their decision processes. So, that's kind of a broad term. So we want to basically condition on quality, right? The thing that referees the thing that kind of equalizes papers, such that we kind of also have a normative assumption that these kinds of papers, again, should have the same probability of acceptance, and they should have the same process of peer review. Although that obviously, again, that's how we feel. Other people may disagree with that. But yeah, so that's our real reason for using these proxies that's our real reason for controlling for quality. Now, the next problem, of course, is that quality is not very well defined itself. So you have to rely on proxies, and they come with their own problems, which we discuss when we actually get to them. Now, conditional. What I also want to emphasize that what we are measuring is capturing both it's capturing discrimination in the sense that conditional on assuming that you bought that our proxies are appropriate ways to equalize and compare like for like, then when we see that there is a differential treatment between papers, and given our normative assumption that there shouldn't be, then what we basically have is a situation of kind of a discrimination that includes both direct discrimination. So that would be I think what people, especially in economics, typically think of, which would be like case-based discrimination or whatever, but also indirect and systemic discrimination is also included in that. So that could be situations, for example, if you have a paper, let's say women have a harder time getting through peer review at this journal, and it's because they writing. I've used this example; it's kind of absurd, but they write in cursive, right? But most of the referees are men. And men have a harder time reading cursive. So because they have a harder time reading cursive, they spend longer on their papers, right? So in that sense, it's not really a direct form. It's not really because of they're not directly discriminating because of the gender. It's not a taste base, but it is creating a situation in which women are experiencing differential outcomes, which is a form of systemic discrimination. Outcomes that obviously there would be a policy fix in that case. Then perhaps have more women as referees. But yeah, so we're capturing kind of both of these things. I also want to emphasize that this is not a cumulative measure of discrimination in the sense that it's not adding on, it's not aggregating past, although it could be incorporating what could have happened in the past could be incorporated in the decision today, but it's not aggregating decisions of the past. So in that sense, it's contemporary. It's not cumulative. Okay, here are the main results. So what we have here are, we're looking here specifically at round specific differences in time spent with referees for papers with a male corresponding author versus papers with a female corresponding author. And this is just a very simple regression. We just basically regress this time variable, again, round specific, on female, a binary variable equal to 1 if the corresponding author is female, plus quality. I'll tell you how I define that in a moment, plus round, so we also control for round, and we also include year fixed effects, which is tau. So we proxy for quality using 3 imperfect measures. So we don't want to claim that these are, but they're imperfect in different ways, such that we think that they actually together probably bound whatever effect is the true effect. So citations, you could think, so citations is one way we do that. Now, the citations are actually ex post of this decision. So they will be accumulated and they could be influenced by, say, the input of the referee. So if referees are helping, perhaps they're helping women along they're more helpful to them in the actual referee process, and that's actually increasing their citations. then that could that may actually bias lead our results to be overestimation. On the other hand, we also, so to get rid of that, to get something that's actually happening at the same time that the actual time spent in peer review, measure proxy for quality that is occurring at the same time that the actual time spent in review is being created, we use referees' recommendations. But this is obviously going to be biased, probably going to bias our results, perhaps even downward, because there may be discrimination in the actual referee's decision. So, referees may actually end up saying, they may be more likely to offer a male author paper a minor revision, and what we would consider to be an equivalent female author paper a major revision. So that would then bias our decision, our results in the opposite direction. And then the final one we use is the editor's decision. So we use all three of these. On the first column, we use citation. Second column, we use referee recommendations. And the third column, we use editor's decision. And the fourth column, we use all of them. And what's actually interesting is that it doesn't really matter. So you can proxy for any of these and you basically get very similar results. And that is that effectively referees spend about 4 to 5 days longer reviewing women's papers. Briefly, you're not technically supposed to interpret coefficients on the variables they're not actually interested in your analysis, but these go along with what you would expect them to, so I'll just mention them anyway. And that is that basically what, one probably would expect more highly cited papers to be reviewed slightly faster, and in our sample they are. And papers in later rounds, which you're probably making, more minor changes, they also tend to be reviewed quicker. And it seems that referees are also quicker to accept than they are to recommend a revision, which is kind of related to the round. So, which acceptance generally comes later in later rounds. Okay, so here we have the same thing, but now we have as our dependent variable the time spent with authors. So this is the amount of time that authors are spending revising, conditional on having received a revise and resubmit decision. Now again, we're using 3 different proxies of quality, citation as before, and then we're also using. Now we don't use referees' individual recommendations, although we could, simply because we wanted to make this analysis at the paper level, and obviously you have more than one referee per paper. So instead we're using a consolidated measure, which is the editor's decision. Although we actually do, if we were to break it down and actually have each observation at the referee level, we get similar results. But anyway, we use the editor's decision, and we use 2 different versions. We use the editor's decision at the end of the previous round. So this would be the decision that the author was responding to when they were actually revising the paper. And then we use also the decision at the end of the current round. So this is the decision, whatever the editor decides after the author has actually revised the paper and sent it back. So we use both of these. Again, controlling for year fixed effects, manuscript quality, and any of our proxies for quality, citations, editor decision in the previous round, or the editor's decision in the current round, we find very similar results. And in particular, we find that women spend about 11 to 13 more days revising their manuscripts during each round of review. So kind of what that's basically saying is that conditional on the underlying quality of the manuscript, women are spending longer revising than men. So then our final thing that we really wanted to look at was, of course, all right, so we have these gaps. Are they in any way related to referee experience? And as I already mentioned, the way that we're going to proxy for referee experience is by taking the number of times an individual referee has reviewed to acceptance a paper in energy economics in the past. So if he's done 5 papers in the past, then it would be 5. Experience here would be 5. If he's done 2, it would be 2. So then we basically perform the exact same analysis that we did on the previous 2 slides, with the exception that we also include this experience variable as well as its interaction with our proxies for gender. Now, on the first panel of these results, we have as the dependent variable the time spent with referees. And in the columns 1 and 2, we have corresponding author. that's how we're proxying for female. We also show results with solo authored papers. So this would be only those papers that obviously they have a female corresponding author and she's authoring alone, just because we see the results are even starker here. So again, looking at time spent with referees, we find, when women are being reviewed by novice referees, so referees who have never reviewed a paper to acceptance to energy economics, they're spending about 4 or 5 days longer. The referees are spending about 4 or 5 days longer reviewing their papers, but the interaction variable is negative. Okay, so it's suggesting that as the experience increases, as these referees get more experience, then it is actually this gender gap is declining. And this is true if we include referees' fixed effects or not. In the solo authored, we find it actually doubles and is now actually significant at traditional thresholds. So, and actually, interestingly, we also see that the coefficient on female is particularly large for solo female authored papers. So what it's suggesting is that actually, it seems that solo female authored papers are the ones that referees are spending an especially long time reviewing. But again, this gap is declining as referee experience increases. Now, on the right-hand side, we're using the dependent variable, the time spent with authors. So this is the time revising, and we see the same trend. So first of all, in columns 4 and 5, again, we're using female corresponding author as the proxy for female. And when we control for experience, actually the coefficient on female jumps. What that's saying basically, and that's as we would expect, and it jumps quite a bit, that women who have been reviewed, who have been given an R&R by a novice referee, actually spent almost 20 days longer in peer review. And it actually jumps up to 30 days longer once we include referee fixed effects. But then once we include, obviously as that referee's experience increases, so as the referee becomes more experienced reviewing for energy economics, then we have a negative coefficient here such that this gap is going to be declining. And then we see actually, obviously the same thing again with solo female author paper, although it is again, even more stark. And I think this graph this is again time spent with authors, and it's kind of rams it home, like, what we're trying to get at. So what we have here, instead of using a continuous measure of experience, we used, we broke experience into 3 categories. So one are novice referees with 0 to 5 papers that they've refereed to experience, to acceptance at energy economics. Expert referees up to 20 papers that they've refereed for energy economics. And then this kind of like special group of power referees who are pretty small in number, but they actually do a lot of refereeing for energy economics. And they're important because these are people who just referee over and over and over again for energy economics. And they are, because of that, they are accepting a lot of the papers that energy economics ends up publishing, due to the mere volume of that they are actually refereeing. And especially these people, obviously they're going to be very familiar with the standards of acceptance at energy economics, because through their repeat reviewing and repeated acceptance, they are basically setting those standards, right? So they're going to be the ones that are most comfortable in whatever standard, they're most comfortable applying the standards. And so what we find effectively is that the green line does not include referee fixed effects. And you see that obviously so again, the gender gap in time spent with authors declines as referee experience increases. The purple includes referee fixed effects. And I find this really interesting, because basically what it's saying is that when the same referee reviews a paper, so when you say as the same referee gains more experience in peer review, the gender gap actually in his reviewing decline. So it's not a select. We're not looking at necessarily a full-on selection effect. It's not just that like the best referees are selecting into being expert. They actually seem to be getting better, which is, I think, quite positive news. So again, basically, when assigned to inexperienced referees, women are going to spend longer than men revising their papers. But when assigned to experienced referees, men spend as long or longer than women revising their papers. We see the same trend when we look at time with referees, but it's a bit noisier. when we break it down with this with these bunches. And it seems that the gap is really only disappearing really amongst the power referees, which is an issue. But given that, you know, the size of the gap, the revision gap is actually, you know, quantitatively much larger than the size of the reviewing gap. We're really excited about the fact that this is declining. And even though this doesn't decline until the power referees, we're a little bit less concerned about that. Okay, so the question I think then is like, what do we have going on? So what we observe is that we have both of these gaps. We find the gap for both reviewing time and revision time, but both of these gaps are declining and they eventually disappear as referees' experience increases. So we are interpreting the joint, like obviously, like if we just found one of these in isolation, there are many different explanations one can come up with. But jointly, we think that they are very strong evidence of statistical discrimination as we have broadly defined. So again, I was saying this to Jenny earlier. We've defined statistical discrimination in a way that is not necessarily always defined. But what we basically mean by this is it can include beliefs that are based on correct as well as incorrect information. It can also include situations in which referees have like a harder time evaluating female authored research, such as my cursive example earlier, because, you know, women have a different writing style and referees are majority male. Or maybe, and makes most sense to me, you can have referees who are referees probably have shortcuts, right? So they're like, I have to determine whether this paper is worthwhile to be published. So they've developed shortcuts to be able to do that because it's a hard job, okay? And they may find that those shortcuts are less relevant for female author papers. But again, the good news is that for whatever reason, experienced referees don't rely so much on those same shortcuts, or they've developed enough experience such that they've created new shortcuts that are also applicable to women's research. So this is a kind of indirect or a systemic discrimination, and which is basically similar to the statistical discrimination from Ager and Kane. So again, basically, how we are defining statistical discrimination is any kind of discrimination that would not occur in the presence of perfect information, okay? But given we have imperfect information, it does occur. Now, so what specifically do we think is happening? Well, again, I've kind of said this before, but just to kind of, you know, make it kind of get the point across. Last time, well, probably not the last time, but we think that really less experienced referees are just less sure about the standards of acceptance, or they're just less knowledgeable about the process of peer review for whatever reason. And so for that reason, they tend to scrutinize more the papers that they are most unsure about, perhaps because their shortcuts don't work as well. So that's why they're most unsure about them. So effectively what they're doing is hedging their position, their positive decisions of offering a revise and resubmit by writing reports that authors are having to spend longer revising. And then the referees themselves are probably spending longer reviewing as well. Again, this relies on the assumption, effectively the assumption that referee assignment is random, although that's actually technically stricter than what we specifically need. So what we need is, so effectively like referee assignment is at least randomized across experience. So it's not that more experience, basically we don't want a situation in which referees are getting, they're getting more experienced referees are getting high quality female author papers, and less experienced referees are getting low quality female author papers. We want whatever things are influencing time spent in peer review to be constant. If they differ across over experience, they differ in the same way for each gender. And then there aren't too many, actually, that also requires a linearity assumption. But yeah, so that's basically what we're getting at. We do actually, I don't spend a lot of time, I'm not going to spend any time in this presentation just because I want to cover other stuff. But in the version of the paper out today now, and we'll also have a new version out very soon, but we actually test this a lot in one of the appendices. So we try to take outcomes that could influence like the amount of time in peer review, such as, for example, citation, like quality, for example, and see if they are at all related across author gender, if they are at all correlated with author gender, conditional, and experience, and we don't find any evidence of that. Okay, so I have 15 more minutes. So I think here I just want to highlight one of the more exploratory areas of our research, but we think it's kind of interesting, and I think it's so I just we're also kind of looking for feedback and try to but understand that this is far more exploratory. So what I have here is I'm again showing time spent with referees. In column 1, it's the exact same regression as before, and we control for editor in column 2, editor fixed effects in column 2, we control for referee fixed effects. In column 3, we control for JEL secondary fixed effects. And we don't really see that much of a difference in the gap at all. When we control for institution fixed effects, however, we see a big jump on that, and that's in column 4, which is interesting. So basically, we're seeing that conditional on institution, the gender gap in revision and reviewing time almost doubles. It also absorbs a lot more variation in the dependent variable, although this could just be because of the large number of institution fixed effects. But it's interesting that, for example, referee fixed effects don't increase the R-score quite as much. All right, the role of, we see the exact same trend when we use time spent revising as the dependent variable. So again, editor fixed effects don't really have an impact. JEL fixed effects, secondary JEL fixed effects don't have an impact. Referee fixed effects also don't really have an impact. What does have an impact are institution fixed effects. So basically what happens is that the coefficient on the gender gap in review time actually ends up doubling when we account for institution fixed effects, just as it did with time spent reviewing. And again, it explains quite a bit of variation, but that could just be due to the fixed effects. So why do we actually observe this sharp increase in the gender gap conditional on institution fixed effects? We're not 100% sure. We don't think it's really related to prestige, or if it is related to prestige, it's related to it in a way one wouldn't expect. So we basically ranked institutions by the number of times their authors have published in energy economics, and use that as kind of like an energy economics specific indicator of prestige. And then we grouped that into 5 different levels. Now the pink line here in the top graph is the amount of time referees spend revising female author paper, and in the lower graph, the amount of time female author papers are spent revising. And the blue line is the amount of time that referees spend revising male author papers, and the blue line below, the amount of time that male authors spend revising their papers. And what's interesting here is actually that we're seeing that as institutional prestige increases, if anything, the gaps are widening. So it is, yeah, it's not really, I mean, basically we're seeing a direction for men that makes sense, okay? We're seeing that as institutions, as men effectively, this isn't a totally accurate interpretation, but just roughly, as men move to institutions that are most relevant to energy economics, basically institutions that publish a lot of people in energy economics, they spend less time in peer review. As women move to institutions where a lot of people are publishing and reviewing and editing for energy economics, however, we do not see the same decline. So what do we think?
Erin, sorry, we aim to finish by 5, including the Q&A. So maybe you can try to wrap up in the next minute or 2.
Yes, actually, this was my last slide. So I would just say, basically, we think that something may be going on, and we may be picking up unobserved heterogeneity in authors' networks. And if this hypothesis is correct, then it suggests that once authors' connections are kind of taken into account, then we're actually still seeing this increase, and in fact, it's getting wider. So what that may suggest is that effectively institutions are less like institutions provide network connections to people, but they seem to do a better job of providing relevant network connections to men than they do to women. But again, this is still exploratory work. So yeah, summary slide, basically, yeah, we're exploiting this kind of exogenous variation of referee assignment, which we can discuss more in the questions. And we find that both of these gaps are declining as referees get more experience. We think this is a form of statistical discrimination, broadly defined, to basically be any kind of differential treatment that would not occur in the presence of perfect information. And we also think it's worthwhile because we think that this actually might identify several potential policy solutions, particularly at journals that are like energy economics, field journals, which are largely male dominated and probably have mostly male referees. So what we have are like within referee comparisons. So the gender gap in peer review is actually declining as the same referee reviews more papers. So that suggests perhaps increase the pool of experienced referees. And I think there's also a program that they've done, for example, in the Institute of Physics that publishes a lot of physics journals, where they basically have a peer review certificate program that one goes through before peer reviewing for their journals, and it's especially useful for really early career researchers who've never really reviewed before. I know the first time I ever reviewed a paper, I was like, what do I do? I mean, and even now, like some of these journals, like I don't know, I've never even read a paper in them, and then I'm like, now I've got to determine whether this paper should be accepted, right? It can be kind of a stressful task, and having some sort of guidance on that may actually may reduce some of these inequalities. It also suggests that perhaps you have to create that experience pool, and you may need to do more than just having a certificate program. They actually probably need experience. So that means like, who are they going to experience on? And again, I say this, like, I'm not saying these things should be tested. I'm not suggesting like run out and just roll them out immediately. These are just suggestions that should for further inquiry, but perhaps sending some of these papers to high prestige men to practice on. So these early novice referees, instead of having to practice on people they are most unsure about, have them practice on people they are least unsure about, at least for a few rounds, and see if that it all helps. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. And if anybody has any questions.
I think we can stop recording.